Well, I'm sure all of you guys know me by now, but if you don't, I'm Matt, and I'll be pitching Sinclair Broadcast Group, recommending a buy, currently closed today at $31.08. My price target is $54. That's roughly a 75% upside in the ticker for your convenience. So a quick agenda today. I'm going to talk about the industry. You might think television is simple, but it's not at all. We're going to go into the company and how they kind of fit into the industry, talk about comparables and competitors, some risks facing Sinclair, my investment rationale, my APV model, and then open up for some Q&A. So before I continue, I just want to kind of set like the perspective. This is not a growth story. This is not like the premise that I'm taking on this particular security. So it's important to realize that it's not exactly like other buy pitches that have been pitched so far. So you'll see why, but kind of keep that in mind as I go through. So when you're flipping through the channels on your television, you see all the channels and they're nicely numbered in a row, and they have shows that go across, for given times. But what you don't really see is the kind of politics that are happening behind the scenes. So there's two types of channels. There are channels that come from broadcasting, regardless of if you have a cable company or not. And then you have channels that come from cable and satellite providers, which are the most common. So broadcast channels are generally either local channels or network channels. Networks are ABC, NBC, Fox, CW. They're networks that really everyone knows because they're almost universal across all of the cable providers. And then there are local networks, which are small. They're called MVPDs, multi-channel video programming distributors. And I don't know if anyone's had RCN, but they were my cable provider when I lived here alone for the first year. They're a local cable provider. And that's an example of one of those. They're not exactly like the big dogs like Comcast, but they operate more locally. And then you have the cable and satellite. You have basic cable, premium cable like HBO, and then you have syndicated programs, which is when a broadcaster licenses out their show to another cable channel. So how broadcasting makes money. Advertising revenue, on average, makes up to 87.4% of total broadcasting revenue. It's annually and quarterly cyclical. So every second and fourth quarter of the year, it goes up because of extra holiday advertising. Every even year, it goes up because of political elections. And every 4 years, it goes up because of the Olympics and presidential elections. It can kind of fluctuate like network to network based on the Super Bowl, because the Super Bowl switches big network every year. So there's some minute factors that go in. You'll kind of see in my model how I took that into account. And then advertising prices are based on how popular your show is. So a show that everybody watches, like SportsCenter, it's going to cost a lot more to advertise on. That's why Super Bowl ads cost so much, because like the cost per viewer has to be so much higher to have that kind of theater. And then there's a concept of commercial inventory, which is essentially like the time that you have per hour to show ads to customers. So the average commercial inventory for an hour of television time is about 15 minutes. And that scales up or down, infomercials and that kind of thing get factored in. And then the war for big sports events. Networks pay a ton of money to get NFL licenses, to get the Super Bowl, to get, I think, on average, it was like $250 million per game. It gets ridiculous, but the war for big sports event is being fought at a very high level by a lot of big network competitors. And then on the right here, I just have a quick breakdown of Sinclair's revenues. This is all mostly the advertising costs they get from network. This includes retrans fees, but I'll get into those later. Those are less of a percentage right now. Local news, they're the #1 local news provider in the country in terms of broadcasting. Syndicate programming, those are all the shows that they license out. And then sports and kind of like paid, direct, to DVR kind of stuff. And then there's retrans fees. This is kind of broadcasting's like, ace in the sleeve. They've been, broadcasting in the industry has been treated very unfairly recently because of some certain regulatory things that limit their operating flexibility, which I'll go into a little bit later. But they make these companies mostly with local and cable companies. And they basically say, okay, you pay me per subscriber to have access to my broadcast signal, because the only money we're making is off of advertising revenue, so we need some sort of diversification. So they MVPDs, they retransmit the broadcast signal for a fee. The fee is paid at a renewal period, so you pay at the beginning of the contract, and you don't pay again until the contract is renewed, adjusting for number of subscribers. And this is actually a much more stable alternative to regular advertising revenue, just because of the cyclicality versus regular subscription payments. And then on the right, I just have the monthly rate paid by these multi-channel video programming distributors per homes passed. And you can see, if you remember from the Disney pitch, ESPN is a ridiculously high one. That's the broadcasting equivalent of a luxury good. And then you have all the way down, through some cable channels down to the cable news network, which is the primary competitor for most local news. And then Sinclair is an average of all the broadcasting companies and their what they charge for transmission fees. So the lower price allows them to be more competitive in local markets with smaller cable providers like RCN. So quick facts about the company. They operate 164 stations in 79 markets, so that's an actual broadcasting station, an actual place. 373 channels come out of those 164 stations. 56.6% of those channels are on a major network like NBC, all of those, CW, Fox, and then 2,000 hours of local news. So that's across the country. I believe that's per week. So these are some examples of their syndicated programming, in case you may have heard of some of them. Just to put Sinclair in a bit of context, Big Bang Theory, Jeopardy, and the Ellen DeGeneres Show are their 3 most popular syndicated licensed programming. So these are the programs that big cable companies are paying a lot of money to license out to other channels. And then the map in the upper left is just kind of a geographic distribution of all their different broadcasting stations, the different markets that they hit. So management is big in the company. It was started by this guy up here, David SMIF, and his 2 brothers, Duncan and Frederick, are also on the board. All 3 of them have over 20 years of broadcast experience. They're all also significant shareholders in the Class B stock, which has 10 votes a share. I believe they own 75% of that. So they have a large stake in the company. And how well it does, and they all have over 20 years of experience within the industry with other companies, as well as the one they have. And the team that they've kind of assembled is a mix of brand new and experience to kind of give the company a little bit of freshness, but also keep some familiar faces around. Everyone has had experience within the broadcasting or the television industry in general. And then some quick comparables. It's a little hard to see. Essentially, Sinclair, their market cap is 3 when the average in the industry is 24. That's kind of brought up by Walt Disney that owns ABC, and that kind of throws things off a little bit. I can forward this to you guys or pull it up differently. Their PE is a little low. I believe it's like $7 below average. But that's again brought up by some of the larger companies that make up this list because they own bigger networks. The main thing to kind of take away from this is that not all of these companies gain all of their revenues from the same revenue streams that Sinclair is trying to get. Sinclair's revenues come from advertising revenue and from retransmission fees. So when you're talking about competitors who's actually going to be taking away revenue space from them, this 183 market cap for Disney, that's not all competing against them. So going into some risks, the biggest risk, and the reason why this pitch isn't a growth story is because they're highly, highly levered. They have a lot of debt. And so looking at this security, you have to realize that they're going to gain value and that they are currently undervalued because they have so much debt. The market isn't pricing them correctly, and as they start to delever, people are going to actually realize their value. So the key mitigator to this risk is a switch over from the cyclical advertising revenues to more stable revenue streams, which I'll get into a little bit later. There's also some company-specific risk. This all has to do with contract renewal. Renewing retransmission consent agreements and renewing network affiliation contracts, because once a broadcaster becomes affiliated with a network like ABC, they automatically become affiliated with all of their smaller affiliate networks that branch off of those. So it kind of has this, viral effect that happens when you affiliate yourself with a network, and they're affiliated with all major networks. So it really comes then down to not getting in a fight when they're getting in these negotiations. In terms of federal regulations, the Fed doesn't really enjoy treating broadcast and cable companies fairly, and this has led to a lot of bad blood between the two, hence where retrans came from. It limits their operating flexibility. They can only reach 39% of the country, whereas a cable provider can reach 100%. Currently, they stay at 38% right now for Sinclair. I think Fox is a comparable at 37%. But at the same time, if they change these regulations to be more fair, it kind of messes up the strategic vision that Sinclair has set up for itself. So it's kind of assumed that none of this is going anywhere, and it's just going to have to operate under the assumption. And then there's macroeconomic risks, corporate profit, disposable income. Corporate profit is directly tied to how much a company is willing to spend on advertising revenue, and then disposable income has entirely what to do with advertising and how much a company is willing to advertise to a consumer that only has so much to spend. So some investment rationale. Essentially, what this comes down to is Sinclair going to be able to reliably pay off the principal of their debt. And my answer is yes, for several reasons. The key is having consistent cash flows. So first off, the 2016 presidential election is going to be huge. They dominate the local news in DC. They own News Channel 8. They dominate, I think it's 10 different state capitals, 25 different state capitals and 10 swing states in terms of where they focus their local news. So politically, they always gain a lot from advertising revenue, and they've purchased a ton of new stations and channels in cash, which is what they've been doing with most of their debt over the last year or two, which leads to retransmission fee renewal. The way that broadcasting companies take advantage of these retransmission fees is by making themselves bigger. The more stations they can acquire, the more leverage they have when negotiating how much the fee is with larger cable companies. Because what happens is if a cable company doesn't agree to have these retransmission fees, the broadcaster just blacks them out. And then all of a sudden they, Big Bang Theory is gone and everyone's, what's going on. So having that kind of size and being able to reach as many markets as Sinclair does is really important for these retransmission fees. And also 75% of their subscriptions are being renewed within the next 15 months. So what's going to become their most consistent revenue moving forward is all being turned around in the next 15 months, which combined with the 2016 presidential election is a huge opportunity to not only grow and expand themselves and continue to build up more stations, but also have the necessary cash to go and start paying back some of their principal. Digital broadcasting is something that they talk about as more of a long-term goal. It's what the industry is starting to transfer to rather than traditional over-the-air broadcasting. So they're currently investing in creating this new platform. The owner is 62 years old, and he's like no one ever sees that these big managers of kind of like an old school broadcasting company would ever be into innovation, but he's such a proponent for it, and he talks about it every time that there's some sort of release about Sinclair, that they're moving towards this digital broadcast, and that it's going to be the future of the industry. And he's really confident about it, and that's where he sees the company going long term. And that's going to compete directly with cable companies to make things a little fair. And then local programming expansion. They're really committing less to this big sports war up at the top and this big network fight, and focusing more on the little guys. They're focusing a lot more on, you know, local sales teams getting, you know, licenses for sporting events. They bought like a pro wrestling, like Ring of Honor pro wrestling agency, which they're using as like part of one of their local sports deals. Building this local programming increases retransmission fee revenue, because they essentially provide some programming for the local news for free, and then get the ad revenue off of that, and then in turn they say, hey, you know, we'll provide you with more of this programming if you pay us these fees. So those four things, going into the next 2 to 3 years, which is my, you know, proposed investment horizon, are going to be key in more consistent cash flows. So going into my model, I believe this is the first time this model has been used this year. It's in just in present value, and essentially what it does is it uses tax shields on interest payments on debt to take into account their changing capital structure. So this is the part that most people should be familiar with. It's just the discounted cash flows going out to 2018. And this is the part that people should be a little less familiar with. We have the debt. This is the principal that is owed per year times the interest expense, and then we're taking out the present value of all tax shield benefits within the scope of the model. And then going through. The big kind of thing that I'll touch upon later is the expected bankruptcy cost. That's essentially a caveat for valuing a like a highly levered company. But going through, subtracting out the debt, getting the number of shares, and the price per share that I got was $54. So there's some key assumptions that I use in my model. I use cyclical growth rates per quarter. I went, you know, down quarters 1 and 3. Odd years were much lower. Even years that weren't a presidential election were a little higher. Presidential election years were the highest years. I kind of use those to gauge, you know, projected advertising revenue, which regardless of how much retransmission fees they get, within the next year or two will still be a sizable portion. A low perpetual growth rate because of the regulations that bar them from further expansion, and then you know, the bankruptcy cost and probability. I got that from Aswath Damodran, who gives the industry standards for bankruptcy probability and cost per industry, so I use the broadcasting standard. So some sensitivity analysis. This is WACC on this side, perpetual growth rate up top, came out to 54. As the WACC starts to get higher, it starts to get a little closer to the current share price. Same if you go over to the 3% on the side, which I kind of included because that's generally people's standard perpetual growth rate. So in the case that regulations start to change, you might see things more towards that side. If, you know, the company starts taking on even more debt, it'll probably come down. You'll start to see some more by the bottom. And then I did this because I got a question on how much bankruptcy cost and probability actually affects this. So this is share price with bankruptcy cost on this side and bankruptcy probability going down. At the current 40% cost and 20% probability, we're at $54. It's not until you get, you know, like 70, 80, it's pretty much impossible. I wouldn't be pitching it if it was 70, 80, because then we'd have $4 share. But this is essentially what it looks like within the realistic range of this yellow box. It's all showing an increase. So in summary, debt repayment story, the transition to more of a subscription, retrans-based revenue model will allow them to have more consistent cash flows, which will have a lower principal repayment risk, and and then the digital platform in the long term.